What's up, everyone? In today's episode, we're talking with Nick Lechnowskyj about Micro ORMs. I've known Nick for a few years now. He frequents the code camps here in Southern California. And when I heard he was going to do a talk about Micro ORMs, I asked if he'd come on the show and share his experience with Micro ORMs and maybe give us some insight into what a Micro ORM really is. Hey, Nick, how's it going?
Pretty good. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, what are you up to these days?
These days, I have a full-time position at a company called Identic Technologies. I'm the lead developer there. We do email encryption, and just briefly on that is a lot of encryption solutions these days require both parties to have a key that they have, a shared key. It's a little bit difficult for people that aren't into technology, so we're trying to provide a solution where it's as easy as sending just regular email. You can send encrypted email just as easy as traditional email methods. And they were primarily working with ASP.NET MVC and a little bit of VSTO. They have an Office plugin.
So VSTO, that's Visual Studio Tools for Office?
That's correct.
Right, and you're doing an Outlook plugin with that, right?
Right. So one of the big selling features is, we can send secure email from our web portal, so online through the browser, but then you can also send secure email through Outlook. We have some pretty interesting ways we get around doing that, but we make it look pretty seamless to the regular user.
And you've been doing some deployment automation recently, haven't you?
That's correct. So coming into this position, it was as simple as just zipping up the website, logging onto the server with remote desktop and unzipping and putting in the files into the directory, making sure you don't push the web config, that typical stuff. So along the way, it's been a constant evolvement of deployment practices. Initially, I had it set up to do web deploy through Visual Studio, so that worked out pretty good. And then we got into the situation where we had more websites, and we had the Outlook plugin that we needed to deploy, and then we had multiple databases. So recently finally got into a position where we can push to a dev environment, a staging environment, and a production environment that all require different configuration variables, whether it be for different email services or PayPal or what have you. So we can push all that stuff automatically, including the databases. So everything gets pushed automatically. There's nothing to worry about, web configs not being pushed or not pushed. Everything gets pushed. So it's been really helpful. There's a lot going on, and deployment takes up a lot of time if you're not automated.
So with all that going on, where are you using Micro ORMs then?
We've experimented with using a different database technology, accessing technology, than Entity Framework. So one of the applications we have is an internal logging web service, it's a web API, and all the different logs that come from our applications, whether they be from an Elma provider and our web app, or even logs that can be sent in one way or another through our Outlook plugin, will eventually make their way through this web API. And it itself is using a Micro ORM, PetaPoco to be specific. So that was kind of the test application for using something like that. It was small, and the queries for it were relatively simple. So far, it's worked out really great. I've had no issues with it.
And so Entity Framework wasn't an option, or it was an option, but it wasn't the optimal option? What made you go with a Micro ORM versus, everybody's favorite ORM, Entity Framework?
So there's a few reasons. I think everybody can agree that ADO.NET is all about speed. But at the same time, writing ADO.NET is not necessarily, in some cases, maintainable. It's verbose. And then you've got the other side of the spectrum. You've got the full-fledged ORM, Entity Framework, or Link to SQL. And I feel like those are both on completely opposite ends of, what they're good at and what they're bad at. And I really wanted something in the middle. I wanted an Entity Framework that was faster, but I wanted an ADO.NET that was easier to write and easier to maintain. And I think the Micro ORM, it does exactly that.
What exactly is a micro ORM? How does it differ from a regular ORM?
So Micro ORM is essentially a stripped down version of a full-fledged ORM. It's an ORM at its base. It handles mapping your database objects into what they call POCOs in the class object. And usually they're going to help you with some type of querying. For instance, Entity Framework has a provider for link, which allows you to use link to access your data that eventually gets translated into SQL. With the micro ORM, specifically PetaPoco, you get a SQL builder, but you're still writing SQL, and you know exactly what you're writing, and there's no question of what that's going to translate into. So I explained a little bit about what an ORM and a micro ORM are. So before we go into too much detail, try to picture something that's in between ADO.NET and Entity Framework. It's a simpler version of Entity Framework, but it's a bit of a wrapper around ADO.NET. And so we talked a little bit about why you'd want to use a micro ORM, and I feel like there's generally two camps in which you might belong to, either into ADO.NET and stored procedures, or you're using an ORM such as Entity Framework, and whether you might be using stored procedures or you might be writing a SQL in your application with a link. And I think depending on where you're coming from, there's going to be different pros and cons. With ADO.NET, I think there's a lot to gain there. You get maintainability and you get productivity because you're writing a lot less code. And from the ORM side of it, if you're looking to perhaps gain a bit of speed or you want more predictable database access, then this is where a micro ORM is going to come into play. I mean, with Entity Framework, depending on your query, you're probably going to want to run that through a profile and see exactly what it's generating.
That's one of the biggest things that I have with ORMs and the usage of ORMs by developers, because especially with Entity Framework, just because you write a simple select, if it's joining on another table, the query that it generates is really complex. It may not be, slow, but it's just doing things that the developers don't understand. I ran into an issue at one point. It was a simple select that a developer had written, but it ended up being a select n+1 scenario. So it worked fine with the test database. We had 10 records, but you get into production and now we literally had 100 records, and it took the whole system down because you have no idea what's going on. So you're saying with a micro ORM, you don't have those kinds of problems?
Not necessarily. I mean, like I said, both are on either side of the spectrum. So, someone that's new coming into this will look at ADO.NET and just be completely either confused by it or overwhelmed by it. But I think Entity Framework has gone too far on the other side of it. It's way too abstracted. Like I said, it's great for your mom and pop apps, but for doing any real work, I think you're going to want to drop down to something that's a little bit more predictable. You can get into a lot of trouble with it, doing selects and not doing toList on it, and you end up running the same query 3 times and not even realizing it, or with lazy loading. I mean, you can turn that off, but Entity Framework is not something that you can simply just jump into and just write code and be like, that's that. You still need to check yourself and check what it's doing. It's very easy to get into trouble.
So why would you not want to use a micro ORM? I've used a couple in the past. Dapper was one of them. And yeah, the whole reason I was needing one was performance, and it was super fast, but I ran into a scenario where I needed to actually do a join, and at that point I was pretty much lost when you compare to the ease of using Entity Framework to just do all that work for you.
Even with a micro ORM, depending on your flavor, whichever one you choose, there's still going to be some research on how to do things. And I mean, there's the same type of research that you had to do initially for learning SQL. There's things in there that are going to help you do things like joins, and it might not be apparent right off the bat how exactly you do that. Luckily, it's low level enough where you can write straight SQL, or you can use a SQL builder to help you do a join, and it's not intrusive to the point where it's like magic. It's just a helper on writing SQL. And I'll just show an example something like that further in the slides.
All right. And you work mostly with PetaPoco, and so you're going to be showing us examples of this. So why PetaPoco? What makes this better than the other micro ORMs out there?
So when I was looking to use something like to use a micro ORM, I did a little bit of research, and I came across PetaPoco. And to be honest, on the front page of their website, they do a little bit of comparing and contrasting between the different ORMs, and it looks like this is a result of looking at all the popular ones like Massive and Active Record for Ruby and Subsonic and Zapper, and taking all those things that were either good or bad and making something that what I feel like is the best out of all of those.
Yeah, I saw the front page. It does look like they tried to take the best from each individual solution because they all have their pros and cons, but it looks like PetaPoco's goal was to take the pros from all of them and wrap them all up into one package. And so that's kind of nice. Now I'm looking at the Fluent interface that you have listed there. That's one thing that I noticed some of the other ORMs, or excuse me, the micro ORMs didn't have. That seems kind of nice. Do you use the Fluent interface often, or?
I do. When I first started, I actually didn't know about it. It actually has a more generic way of using it, and it's just a dot append. I mean, you can essentially do this as a glorified string builder. You can do dot append on it, or you can use these more helpful classes. If you use dot append, you actually have to include, select, from, and where keywords in the query. But it helps you nicely write individual statements. What you'll notice is that this accepts an argument to be able to pass the city in. The ordinal of each variable is reset on each line. So if I perhaps could do it on the from line, it would start at 0 and go 1, 2, 3, and then on the where line, I could start at 0 again. Where, as in a SQL statement, you'd have to keep track of those ordinals.
So that's kind of nice. Now you don't have the example of just the entire query written out in a single, query statement, but that kind of throws off a lot of developers. They think, oh man, I'm writing select queries inside of my code, and then you get back to the whole SQL injection thing, and it kind of throws developers off. This Fluent interface is pretty nice because even though it's doing the same thing, just visually it gives you a different image of what actually is going on. And it's nice to know that there's parameters in there so developers don't have to do string concatenation and worry about the SQL injection.
Right. It offers a really clean way to do your querying. You don't have to, like you said, you don't have to mess around with the SQL parameters. You just plug it right in. One thing that might not be apparent is this select and from and where. This is not your typical link and where from the IEnumerable and iQueryable classes. These are specific methods from the builder class, the SQL builder class.
That's an important note to make sure developers understand that most of the micro ORMs don't support link. Yeah, if you come into a Fluent interface and you're expecting these select and froms to work like they were from a link provider, they're going to be sorely mistaken.
Right, and then this is where you can kind of get into researching the difference between link. I mean, I think a lot of people came into link and seeing this type of interface, and then seeing it somewhere else and thinking, oh, that's link, and it's not. It's just a Fluent interface, which is what link is.
Right.
So it's important to know that distinction.
So talk a little bit about the T4 templates. How do those play into PetaPoco?
So the T4 templates are awesome. One thing I didn't want to do is create all of my classes by hand. And then something changes in the database, and then I have to make sure that I'm maintaining those classes and all that. I wanted to drop down a little bit to get more flexibility, but I didn't want it to be so overblown that I was spending all my time maintaining some data access library. And what it essentially does is it's as easy as defining a connection string in your app config or your web config. And when you download the NuGet package for PetaPoco, it will give you a T4 template that you can just assign your connection string name to. And when you run it, it will go to that database, query all those tables for you, and build up all of your classes that you'd be querying with. Essentially, what Entity Framework and Link to SQL do for you. You don't get that visual designer, but you get all of those entities all of those classes generated for you, and it will name them all so they're singular instead of plural, and you get more control over it if you want. But just out of the box, to get it running, you can just plug in a connection string and be ready to go.
So with the classes that it generates, does that mean that PetaPoco will take the results from your query and map those to your POCOs or your classes? Or do you still get the data reader, data set, ADO stuff?
It will do the mapping. That example is not shown on this slide, but we have some examples further in that can show that. But it will definitely map that. That's one of the big maintainability pieces that I didn't want to deal with, is having to do the mapping.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest things that eats up developer time, and I always just code gen that stuff out. So the fact that they do it for you, that's very nice. So you've got some code to show us. You're going to show us how to use PetaPoco, is that right?
Yep.
All right, well, let's switch over to that. Get going.
So we've got a customer repository here. I'm actually using the Northwind database. It's got a customer stable. And I've written a few queries to show the difference between how you do this if you're writing ADO.NET inline, you're not using a store procedure, and then how you would do it with PetaPoco. And I've got a few examples of that.
What are we looking at right now? We're looking at just a standard ADO.NET using SQL commands and...
Right. So if you were going to write ADO.NET, this is probably what it would look like. You get your connection string, you'd open up a connection, you'd new up a SQL command, start defining what it is you want to do with the database. I wanted to get customers from the database by city, and then you'll notice that you also have to do you specify a SQL parameter to guard against SQL injection, and then you actually need to execute the query, and in this case, get data back. So if there's no rows, we need to just return, or if there is rows, then we start our adventure in mapping. So you've got to come through here and cast everything, because they're all objects. So I think this could potentially be a big maintenance nightmare.
That's absolutely the worst. I hate doing that, especially with large POCOs and large tables. It's such a nightmare.
Right. So moving on, we can see this is quite a bit of code just to get customers out of the database. Everyone coming from the ORM world is, looking at this like, oh my gosh, so you guys actually do this? So this right here would be changed a little bit if we're doing a stored procedure, but overall we're still writing quite a bit of code. So moving on to the first PetaPoco example, we could shorten this down. So here's the fluid interface for the builder, the SQL builder. As I was talking about, you can generically use it with just .append methods. It looks like a string builder. And you can see that the keywords select from where included in here. There's nothing different from just writing this on one line. I could write this entire thing in just one append statement, but it's easier to organize it. It's easier to read this way. And so this is as simple as just creating an instance of the database object. This is PetaPoco's database object. It takes in the connection string name. And finally, when I want to get the data, I call a method called fetch, and it's a generic method. It takes in a type, and all I do is pass in a SQL, and it will do the mapping for me and return a collection of customers. So as you can see, quite a bit shorter. You don't have to mess with your SQL connection or SQL command or any of that.
That's not so bad. That's a lot cleaner than the ADO code you had above. What I really like is the parameters, because above you have to name your parameters. With this, you just give it, an index position, and you're good to go.
Right. So this can be improved even further, I think. And so this is the example that I showed in the slide. With the Fluent Builder, you can eliminate your select, from, and where keywords by using the appropriate methods. They even have methods for joining. You can do inner joins and left joins. So let's say I was going to do a join, and then they even have the on. So it makes it, I think, in my opinion, a lot easier to read.
that does make it a lot easier to read. That inner join, that's very nice. Now again, even though it's just doing string concatenation in the background, so this is just syntactic sugar, but it's really nice. You're coming into it, and God, you can't imagine how many times I've seen massive methods where they're just concatenating string after string, putting together these big giant SQL queries. It's just ridiculous. This is much cleaner, much nicer.
Right. I've been in a few development shops where everybody's got their own version of their SQL Builder class, and this company's goal wasn't to build SQL Builder, so it was always just good enough to get by, and there's always issues with it, or you're looking at it, you're like, oh my gosh, why did this developer write this code like this? It's just insane. I think this really kind of standardizes that. Somebody has specifically spent time on doing just this, so you can leverage that in your own code.
It's really nice because I don't prefer ORMs. I'm not really a fan of Entity Framework for various reasons, but if I do need an ORM, I'll just bang out a small sample app with link to SQL or something. But mostly I write my code in ADO.NET, but like you showed above, there's quite a bit of boilerplate that goes into that code. So this is very nice. It's very succinct, very clean, very maintenance friendly, I would say.
Exactly. So with these examples, they're pretty naive. They just select from one table. What we can do is we can actually have it map from the related tables. So PetaPoco's generated a customer object for me, and we can go look at that real quick. So this is what it's generated for the customer. And there's actually orders associated with the customer. So what I've done is create I've created another customer class, and notice that it's a partial class, and I've added on to that class with the orders. And so basically, you can get back a customer object with a list of orders within it. And so the way that works in PetaPoco is the inner join. So as you can see, I've added this part of the query to join on the customer ID of both tables. And then down here, it gets a little bit interesting. So what you've got is table 1, which is customer, table 2 is order, and then the third type is what I want back. So I actually want the customer object back. And then this takes a Lambda expression that you can use to help it map the data that comes back. So for each order that comes back, I want to use the customer class with the orders property, and I want to add. So remember, this was a list of orders. So for each one, I'm going to add it to it, and then it's going to return the customer. And then this is the SQL from the builder. So depending on the complexity of the query, you can actually eliminate all of this, and it'll automatically map it for you. But in this case, I needed to help it out. And the way it does this is it looks through all of the rows that come through, and it maps the first set. And then when it gets to the next property that's not in there, it goes and looks in the child entity to start mapping. One of the examples I wanted to show is if you wanted to use stored procedures. In the real world, you're probably using stored procedures. If you're, maybe you're using ADO.NET, you're using stored procedures. And so what we can do here is we can still make this simple. We can execute a stored procedure, and we can pass it our city variable and still define what we want to get back. In this case, we're specifying a specific type. However, we can do a few different things with this. As you can see on the second example, we can actually use the dynamic keyword. If you're using .NET 4, you can use dynamic, and additionally, you can use named parameters and actually pass in an anonymous object. This piece right here, you could use up in the first one, but I just wanted to show the different things you can do with this fetch method.
That's a heck of a lot better than writing that execute code, doing it by hand, regular ADO.
Right. I've gone ahead and shown you, what this looks like, how we can improve upon all the code that you have to write for traditional ADO.NET query. Let's look at what a PetaPoco gives you out of the box when you download the NuGet package and how this works. So you'll see in my Solution Explorer, I've got a couple of folders. So repositories is the one that I made for the customer repository, but the models folder is actually what PetaPoco is going to give me. And so this is PetaPoco class where all of its main logic is. Not much to do there. The generator is where you're going to do your work at. So initially, when you first download the NuGet package, you're going to go on to find this database T4 template. And they initially give you some properties to work with and actually some examples. So the first thing that I did was I specified my connection string name. And then you can specify a namespace and a bunch of other properties. Additionally, when it goes to create all these tables for you, you can override certain things. So you can ignore specific tables. You can change the name of a class. Maybe if I didn't want to use customers, I could name it customers 2 or something. You can do the same for properties. I actually had one instance where we were doing some migration work from a MySQL database, and PetaPoco was having a difficult time with some of the types that it was inferring, and I actually had to specifically tell it that I want to use a GUID for this column. So that's where you can do that. And it's as simple as just hit save on it, and it will generate your database stuff.
Personally, I like T4 templates. I know there's some ORMs, they give you the fluent interface to be able to specify some of these things, but this is a really nice way of doing it. Now, as far as this file goes, the only thing you have to do initially is to specify your connection string name.
Right, so I've gone ahead and done that in my app config. So here's my connection string, it's all standard. And here, yeah, it's as simple as just specifying the name. And then you'll see all the generated objects that it gives you. In this case, I don't have the database hooked into the solution, actually.
Now, what's in the PetaPoco class? Is that the entire Micro ORM?
It's actually, right, it's a single file. How long is it? It's about 4,200 lines.
Wow.
It's a lot larger than Massive. I think Massive is considerably less. But the value that it brings, I think, is worth it. So one of the things that makes PetaPoco so quick is, especially on doing the mapping, is like Dapper, it uses dynamic method generation to assign the column values to properties.
Now, does it do that at the IL level?
That's correct.
Like you said earlier, it's like somebody took their version of a SQL builder and they kind of standardized it and made it nice, and now they're including it. But this isn't a dependency assembly. This is just a class that goes right into your project. So you don't have any issues with, versioning or distribution. But also, if you wanted to get in there and, take a look at the guts and learn how they're doing it, or you need to make modifications, you can. It's all right there.
Right, and if you don't want to use the SQL Builder class, you don't even have to use it. You could just write straight SQL if you wanted to. But the few things that it really provides, the mapping, the SQL Builder, it's huge. It also supports transactions. I used that in the migration project I was talking about. We're moving stuff over, we use the transaction, and it worked out really well. I was super happy with it.
So it seems like a pretty complete product then. I mean, really has most of the things that the majority of developers are going to need when working with an ORM, aside from a visual drag and drop editor. But most of us are going to code first anyway, so we already have our POCOs, and we're just wiring it up to an existing database anyway. So
right, and we're actually looking into using it in more of our main projects over Entity Framework. That should be pretty interesting.
There's a lot of criticism for micro ORMs, and I honestly think that more and more development teams are going to be going towards micro ORMs because they need the performance from the micro ORM, but they don't want to write all that boilerplate from the ADO.NET code. But, there's a lot of criticism. They're saying that this is really unnecessary. And, I read a comment. Someone said micro ORMs are the new NoSQL, except that NoSQL makes sense. Everybody has their own opinion, but I think this is going to be the way it's going to go because Entity Framework is nice. It does a lot of different things. It's a very advanced product, but most of the development teams that I interact with, they don't use Entity Framework. It's just not really in the direction that they want to go with their code base.
Right. Yeah, I can understand those opinions people have. It's especially just with anything, it's difficult to give praise to it right away. I mean, it's going to take some time, and just because you don't need speed, I don't think is necessarily the best argument. I don't think that writing data access with PetaPoco is that much slower than writing it with Entity Framework in the sense that you're looking at it from the entire picture. If you really want to do Entity Framework right, I think you're going to have to spend a lot of time profiling it and looking at what it's generating, and in some cases, dropping down completely into a stored procedure, or not using it at all, depending on what your query needs are. Even on smaller projects that I have that I used to write in Link to SQL or Entity Framework from the beginning, I just write it in PetaPoco now for the stuff that really doesn't really matter. I just do it anyways because it's not slow. It's still quick to get up and running with it, and I've already got that speed already, so it just seems like a win-win situation.
Yeah, as far as the trustability of PetaPoco versus Entity Framework, really, once you write a query in PetaPoco, you can profile it once, and that's pretty much how that product is going to work in the future. But with Entity Framework, every query that you write, you're going to have to profile it and make sure that it's actually doing what you're expecting it to do.
Right. And I mean, I think a lot of people don't go that route. I mean, a lot of people write the queries and they're like, okay, well, the app's not slow. But it's interesting. We actually one day started profiling a few pages that we had on our website, and I noticed a few queries that were pretty heavy. They did a lot of joins, and there's a lot of stuff going on. It was actually being run 3 times unnecessarily. It just needed to be run once. But it was, that query, the data from that query was being accessed in different places, and it ended up, requerying over and over. So it's just things like that. And there was just no need. We could have wrote it in PetaPoco to begin with and probably not had that problem. But I mean, it's not necessarily Entity Framework's fault. All in all, you need to understand exactly what you're using, and just because Entity Framework allows you to write things so easily doesn't mean you shouldn't understand them completely.
Exactly. It's a great tool. It's very powerful, but with great power comes great responsibility. And unfortunately, developers they take everything for granted. So you can get PetaPoco from NuGet, right? There's no licenses. It's all free to use.
Right. It's open source. Or you can get it from their website. The company is called top10software.com /PetaPoco. There's a lot of good examples on there. So that's basically where I learned how to use it.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you coming on the show and showing us PetaPoco.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
All right, that's it for this episode. Be sure to subscribe to our channel, follow us on Twitter and Facebook, and visit codeporn.com when you have nothing better to do. If you have an idea for an episode or want to be a guest on an episode, send an email to codeporn.show@gmail.com and let me know. Thanks for watching.